So, let's get right into it. We're about to break down a moment where a single court ruling in the US just explodes into this massive international crisis. We're talking about a showdown that pits a president against his own Supreme Court, sends shockwaves through the global economy, and honestly threatens to redraw the entire world map.
And it all really kicks off with this single defiant statement. I mean, the highest court in the land makes a ruling, and the response isn't to comply. It's basically a declaration of war on the ruling itself. So how on earth did we get to this point?
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning, with the judicial explosion right at the heart of the US government that really set this whole firestorm in motion.
This right here was the trigger. On February 20th, after nearly 1,800, that's right, 1,800 lawsuits were filed against the tariffs, the Supreme Court handed down a verdict, and it was seen as a total knockout blow to one of the administration's biggest economic policies.
Now, this slide really gets to the heart of the whole constitutional debate. The administration's argument was basically that the president could act alone, using something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. But the court, well, they pushed back, and they pushed back hard. They said, not so fast. This is a textbook separation of powers issue. The executive branch can't just decide to take over powers that belong to Congress. And the power to tax and set tariffs, that, they made very clear, belongs to Congress, period.
And, this wasn't some narrow 5-4 squeaker of a decision. No way. It was a decisive 6-3 majority, a really clear, loud statement from the court about the limits of presidential power.
But this is where the story takes a turn that is just unprecedented. In a direct challenge to the Supreme Court's authority, the White House announced that, nope, the tariffs are staying. And then, and you really can't overstate how wild this was, they doubled down. They imposed a new 10% tariff on pretty much everyone. This wasn't just a political disagreement anymore. This was a head-on confrontation with the judicial branch itself.
So, as you can imagine, this legal chaos didn't just stay bottled up in Washington. It immediately spilled out into the global economy, and the shockwaves were felt everywhere.
It's a massive question, right? And the initial answer was just complete and utter confusion. Markets were reacting in totally opposite ways, just trying to figure out what this new reality even was.
At first, Wall Street actually saw a silver lining. The markets rallied. The S&P, the NASDAQ, the Dow, they were all up. The thinking was pretty simple. Hey, if the tariffs are illegal, they have to go away, right? You could almost feel the relief in the air.
But while the stock market was optimistic, the US dollar immediately went down. Now, a 0.3% drop might not sound like a lot, but for a currency, it signaled this deep uncertainty about the stability of the US government itself. It was basically a vote of no confidence.
And at the very center of all that uncertainty was this number, $175 billion. That's how much money had already been collected from these tariffs that were now officially illegal. And this became the giant, multi-billion-dollar elephant in the room. See, the Supreme Court struck down the tariffs, but they gave zero guidance on whether this massive pile of cash had to be repaid. For the U.S. Treasury, which was already dealing with trillions in debt, the idea of having to refund $175 billion was a potential disaster. It left businesses and even whole countries in total legal limbo.
But this whole mess wasn't just about money. The financial uncertainty was matched by a really fast breakdown of political trust on the world stage.
The focus pretty quickly shifted to what's often called the special relationship between the US and the UK. That super close diplomatic and military bond they've had for decades. The big question was, could this cornerstone of the Western alliance actually survive this level of turmoil?
And the answer, it seemed, was no. This whole tariff fight was basically like pouring gasoline on a couple of fires that were already burning. First, the US wanted to use a British military base for a potential strike on Iran. The UK's response? A flat-out, not from our soil. And second, just as America was pushing hard to isolate China, Britain's prime minister was doing the exact opposite, trying to build deeper trade ties with Beijing. And it wasn't just the UK. The administration also turned on its northern neighbor, Canada, threatening them with crippling 100% tariffs for doing the exact same thing, trying to build its own independent trade relationship with China. The message from Washington was crystal clear. You are either with us or you are against us.
But here's the thing about this kind of pressure campaign. It didn't have the effect you might think. Instead of getting America's allies to fall in line, it actually pushed them to start looking for alternatives, potentially redrawing the geopolitical map in the process.
a realization started to sink in across London, Ottawa, and other world capitals. The thinking was, if the U.S. is going to act this unpredictably, defying its own courts and threatening its closest friends, then maybe relying on them just isn't a good strategy anymore.
And they started taking concrete, deliberate steps. These weren't just angry press releases. These were real actions. Britain moved forward with its China strategy. Canada started aggressively pursuing new trade groups to become less dependent on the U.S. And then most importantly, the UK and Canada started formal talks on a new joint defense pact, which is a massive signal that they were building a security plan that didn't revolve around Washington.
And then came this move, which honestly, nobody saw coming. Canada shocked everyone by officially joining a European Union defense funding program. Just let that sink in for a second. They became the first and only non-European country to ever do that. And at the same time, Ottawa announced a massive $366 billion plan to upgrade its military. I mean, these aren't just minor policy changes. These are the kinds of foundational, strategic shifts that you only see once in a generation.
Which of course brings us to the final critical question. When a president defies his country's highest court, when the world economy is thrown into chaos, and when your closest allies start making military pacts without you, are we watching the first cracks appear in a world order that has been in place for nearly 80 years? That is the question this crisis leaves us all with.